Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
Today we're digging into quite a stack of sources. We've got articles, news reports, briefings.
Yeah, from places like the Arab Weekly, BBC, Al Jazeera, the New Arab, ITV, AP, Security Council Report, CBS News. Quite a range.
All focused on this latest Gaza ceasefire proposal, the one backed by the U.S.
And our job really is to pull out the key bits of information from all this material. What's actually in the proposal? How are the different sides reportedly responding?
And maybe most importantly, what's holding things up right now? What are the sticking points, according to these sources?
Exactly. We want to give you the core facts based only on the documents we have in front of us. Kind of a shortcut through the noise.
Okay, let's unpack it. So the proposal itself, what are the basics here, according to the reports?
Well, it's consistently described as a U.S. initiative. And Special Envoy Steve Witkoff's name comes up repeatedly as the broker.
Okay, and there's something about guarantees. I saw that mentioned.
Yes, that seems significant. Multiple sources mention it's reportedly guaranteed by U.S. President Donald Trump and also the mediators, Egypt and Qatar.
That definitely adds weight. And the core mechanism, what's the headline?
The headline is a 60-day ceasefire. A pause in the fighting, basically.
Right, 60 days. Now, this is where, looking through the sources, things get a bit, well, inconsistent, the proposed exchange.
Yeah, the numbers reported do vary quite a bit. It's interesting. Some sources, for instance, talk about the first week involving the release of 28 Israeli hostages, that's alive and deceased,
Okay.
in exchange for 125 Palestinian prisoners. These are specified as prisoners serving life sentences, plus the remains of 180 dead Palestinians.
But then other reports have different figures for the Palestinian side in that same first week, right?
Exactly. Some report the same 28 Israeli hostages, again, alive and dead, but for a much larger number, 1,236 Palestinian prisoners, and still the remains of those 180 dead Palestinians.
Wow, that's a huge difference. 125 versus over 1,200.
And there's even a third variation reported. One source mentions 10 living hostages plus some bodies exchanged over the whole 60-day pause for over 1,100 Palestinian prisoners, and it specifically calls out 100 of those as serving long sentences.
So straight off the bat, you see these discrepancies just on the exchange numbers. It really highlights how information can differ depending on the source. What else is reportedly part of this deal?
Aid. Humanitarian aid is definitely mentioned. Sources say it would start flowing into Gaza as soon as Hamas signs.
Immediately.
Some reports specify immediate humanitarian aid, yes. And they also mention the remaining 30 Israeli hostages being released later, tied to a permanent ceasefire being implemented down the line.
Okay. And the broker, Witkoff, he's apparently optimistic.
That's reported, yes. They express optimism about getting an agreement.
All right. So that's the proposal framework as reported. What about Israel's reaction? What did the sources say?
Well, the reporting indicates Israel has accepted this U.S. proposal.
Accepted. Flat out.
That's what White House statements and Israeli media reports cited here suggest. And Prime Minister Netanyahu reportedly told hostages' families that he accepted the plan.
Okay, but there are usually conditions, right? Especially in these situations.
Yes, and that's where the nuance comes in, highlighted in the Israeli media and Netanyahu's own public statements referenced here. Israel's acceptance is reportedly conditional.
How so?
They reportedly insist it's only a temporary truce unless Hamas completely disarms. That seems to be the main condition.
And Netanyahu's been public about that?
Very much so, according to these sources. He's quoted saying there's no way we will stop the war until Hamas is defeated. But he was open to a temporary halt for hostage release.
So temporary pause, okay, permanent stop, only after Hamas is gone.
Essentially, yes. He's also reported as saying the war ends only when all hostages are back and Hamas is destroyed or disarmed with its leaders exiled. That's a high bar.
So the reported acceptance is really tied to achieving those specific war aims regarding Hamas.
Precisely. It's not necessarily an acceptance of a path to a permanent ceasefire without those conditions being met first. And notably, even with these talks, our sources report Israeli military operations are continuing in Gaza. Strikes are still happening.
What about the aid situation? Israel's role there, according to the sources.
Well, they report Israel has allowed some aid in recently. They partially lifted a blockade imposed back in March.
But is it enough?
Consistently reported as no. The volume is low, described as far below what's needed.
And there's this new aid group mentioned. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation.
Yes, the GHF. It's reportedly backed by the U.S. and Israel, and it has started distributing some aid.
But it's controversial.
It seems so. Sources mention criticism from the UN and other aid organizations. The main points reported are that it's insufficient and, crucially, that it allows Israel significant control over aid distribution, who gets it, where it goes.
In the UN's position.
The officials quoted reiterate that under international law, Israel, as the occupying power, has the obligation to facilitate aid. That's a recurring point in the sources.
And just to add context, while all this ceasefire talk was happening, something else was going on, right? The settlements.
That's right. The sources note that concurrently, Israel approved 22 new Jewish settlements in the occupied West Bank.
And that didn't go unnoticed.
No. The British government, for example, is cited condemning it as a deliberate obstacle to Palestinian statehood.
And wasn't there a quote from Israel's defense minister about the intention behind it?
Yes, quite direct. Reportedly calling it a strategic move that prevents the establishment of a Palestinian state and something that strengthens our hold on Judea and Samaria. So that action is happening alongside the truce talks.
Okay, which brings us to Hamas. How have they reportedly reacted to this U.S.-backed proposal?
The descriptions used are things like cool and cautious.
So not jumping at it.
Definitely not. Sources say they're studying it with full national responsibility, but senior officials have voiced pretty significant reservations.
And are they specific about why they have reservations? What are their stated objections?
Yes, they are. Hamas officials, quoted in our sources, state very clearly that the current terms do not meet their key demands.
Which are?
Primarily, a commitment to actually end the war, a full withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza, and allowing sufficient unrestricted aid into the territory.
I saw a quote from Bassem Naim.
Yes, from Hamas's political bureau. He reportedly said the proposal does not meet any of our people's demands, foremost among them halting the war and famine. And he apparently characterized it as meaning the perpetuation of the occupation and the continuation of killing and famine. Pretty strong words.
And others echo that.
Yeah, another senior official, Sami Abu Zuri, is reported saying the terms basically mirrored Israel's position and lacked those commitments ending the war, troop withdrawal, aid access that Hamas has been demanding.
Are there other concerns mentioned beyond those core demands?
Trust seems to be a big one. They're reportedly seeking clear guarantees, specifically from the U.S., that Israel won't just resume attacks during or right after a ceasefire.
So they're worried it's just a pause before things get worse.
That seems to be the fear reported. One source has a senior Hamas official saying they'd likely reject the proposal, partly because there wasn't a clear humanitarian protocol for aid, and that the terms seemed different from earlier talks. Another source also indicated a rejection was likely.
And what about the disarmament issue Israel wants at Hamas?
Hamas has reportedly refused point blank to disarm unless Israel withdraws completely and commits to a permanent end to the fighting.
Why? What's their stated rationale for that?
The reported fear is that if they give up hostages during just a temporary pause, Israel will then have a free hand to launch an even bigger offensive aimed squarely at destroying them.
So it's this fundamental linkage again. Hamas ties hostage release to a permanent end and withdrawal. Israel ties a permanent end to Hamas's defeat.
Exactly. That seems to be the core deadlock reported. And sources indicated Hamas was expected to give its formal response very soon, Friday or Saturday.
Okay, so we've got the proposal details, Israel's reported conditional acceptance, Hamas's reported reservations, and likely rejection. If you synthesize all that, what do these sources point to as the main roadblocks? Why is this so difficult?
Well, it really comes down to these deep, fundamental disagreements highlighted across the board. The absolute biggest one seems to be the nature of the ceasefire itself. Is it temporary, as Israel reportedly accepts, or permanent with full withdrawal, as Hamas demands?
And that's tied directly to the fate of Hamas.
Absolutely. Israel reportedly insists on defeating or dismantling Hamas, getting them disarmed and out of power before any permanent end to the war. Hamas, as we've seen, refuses to disarm without that permanent end and withdrawal precisely because they fear being destroyed afterward. It's a catch-22.
A seemingly irreconcilable difference based on these reports.
It appears so. Then you have the disagreements over the actual exchange mechanics. The numbers, as we saw, are reported differently, but also the timing. Israel reportedly wants all hostages back before the war permanently ends. Hamas links hostage returns to a permanent end and withdrawal.
And aid is still a problem, too.
Yes, a major point of contention. Hamas demands unrestricted aid, to deal with the crisis, but the sources talk about ongoing obstacles, concerns about the actual volume getting in, and this controlled distribution via things like the GHF.
And underpinning all of this,
that trust deficit we mentioned. It seems huge. Hamas seeking U.S. guarantees reflects that. And actions reported alongside the talks, like the settlement building Israel approved.
Which its own defense minister linked to preventing a Palestinian state.
Right. And the reports of Israeli discussions about voluntary emigration from Gaza, which Hamas calls ethnic cleansing. These things, reported in our sources, don't exactly build confidence. They likely just deepen the mistrust.
And these aren't new problems, are they?
No, the sources indicate these are basically the same core issues that caused a previous longer ceasefire attempt to collapse back in March. History repeating, perhaps.
And all this negotiation, or lack thereof, is happening while the situation on the ground in Gaza is? Well, how do the sources describe it?
Critical. Deteriorating rapidly.
Yeah.
Dire.
Can you give us some specifics from the reports?
Nearly 2 million people are reported to be at risk of famine. Hundreds of thousands are already facing what's described as catastrophic levels of hunger.
And the aid we talked about isn't getting there fast enough.
Nowhere near fast enough, according to the reports. That UN Secretary General quote really sticks out. A teaspoon of aid when a flood of assistance is required. And distribution is reportedly hampered by everything from military operations and bureaucracy to actual looting.
People are still being displaced, too.
Hundreds of thousands displaced again recently due to Israeli ground operations, adding to the huge numbers already displaced. One source puts the overall figure around 90% of Gaza's population.
And the human cost.
Devastating. The death toll reported by the Hamas-run health ministry is over 54,000. Sources do note that figure doesn't distinguish combatants from civilians.
The one source specified most were described as women and children.
Yes, that detail is in one report. And much of Gaza itself is described as simply ruins or uninhabitable. At the same time, sources also mention that Hamas is reported to be significantly weakened militarily.
So just to wrap up the key takeaways from this pile of sources, we have this U.S.-backed proposal. Israel has reportedly accepted it, but with major conditions tied to ending the war and dismantling Hamas.
While Hamas's response is described as cool, likely heading towards rejection because the proposal reportedly doesn't meet their core demands, a permanent end to the war, full Israeli withdrawal, and unrestricted aid.
Their formal answer is expected any moment now.
And the humanitarian crisis, as described in these sources, just makes the need for some kind of resolution incredibly urgent. But those fundamental demands, they still seem miles apart based on this reporting.
Looking at everything we've just unpacked from these sources, the reported positions, the conditions, the demands, the actions on the ground, what stands out to you as the single biggest barrier, the toughest knot to untangle here?
Honestly, it feels like that fundamental clash over the endgame. Israel's reported insistence on destroying or neutralizing Hamas before agreeing to permanently stop fighting, versus Hamas's reported insistence on a permanent ceasefire and withdrawal before they would ever consider disarming, precisely because they fear being destroyed. It's like a complete impasse based on totally opposing core objectives, at least as reported here.
It really lays bare the challenge, doesn't it? That the deep divide reported in these documents. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.